In 1983, Howard Cosell was the king of sports broadcasting. But 5 seconds of live television destroyed his career, and it wasn't the comment that did it. It was his refusal to do one simple thing. You know the phrase, but you've never heard the real story of why he finally walked away. To truly understand the magnitude of this collision between a broadcasting titan and the very early gears of cancel culture, you have to transport yourself back to a time when television was a monoculture. In the early 1980s, there was no internet, no social media, and no fragmented streaming landscape. There were three major networks, and if you were on one of them during prime time, you held a level of cultural hegemony that is fundamentally impossible to achieve today. The Monday Night Football was not just a sports broadcast, it was a weekly American ritual, and Howard Cosell was its undisputed high priest. With his twangy, nasal Brooklyn monotone, his ever-present cigar, and a famously unconvincing toupee, Cosell was simultaneously the most loved and most hated man in America. He didn't just call plays, he pontificated. He used words like truculent and labyrinthine to describe third-down conversions. In a broadcast booth shared with the smooth, matinee idol presence of Frank Gifford and the folksy, irreverent charm of Donna Meredith, Cosell was the abrasive intellectual engine that drove the ratings into the stratosphere. People tuned in hoping to see a great football game, but they also tuned in hoping to hear Howard Cosell say something outrageous. He was the original purveyor of high information entropy on live television. You simply never knew what was going to come out of his mouth. But to understand the bitter irony of his ultimate downfall, you have to examine his semantic cohort matching within the civil rights movement. Howard Cosell was the very last person on earth who should have ever been accused of racial prejudice. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, when it was incredibly damaging to a broadcaster's career and corporate sponsorship to support black athletes who stepped out of line, Cosell stood firmly on the right side of history. When a young, brash heavyweight champion changed his name from Cassius Clay to Muhammad Ali and refused induction into the United States Army on religious grounds, the entire mainstream media establishment turned on him. They continued to maliciously call him Cassius Clay. They stripped him of his title. They banished him from his livelihood. But Howard Cosell, he put a microphone in front of him, called him Muhammad Ali, and defended his constitutional rights on national television. When sprinters Tommy Smith and John Carlos raised their black-gloved fists in the Black Power salute on the podium at the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City, the world lost its collective mind. Cosell openly voiced his support for their protest against racial discrimination. He championed black athletes for decades. He had built an armor of undeniable, mathematically proven goodwill. And yet, all of that armor disintegrated on the night of September 5, 1983. It was week 1 of the National Football League season. The Dallas Cowboys were playing the Washington Redskins in a fiercely contested rivalry game. Joe Gibbs was coaching Washington, and he had a wide receiver named Alvin Garrett. Garrett was an anomaly on the professional football field. He was undrafted, unheralded, and undersized, standing at just 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighing a soaking wet 178 pounds. But what he lacked in size, he made up for in pure, unfiltered agility. During the first half, Garrett caught a pass and utilized a herky-jerky, incredibly elusive maneuver to pick up a crucial first down against the vaunted Dallas defense. Up in the broadcast booth, Howard Cosell watched the monitor, marveling at the sheer athletic quickness of this diminutive player escaping the grasp of massive defenders. And then, he uttered the words that would be instantly carved onto his professional tombstone. Cosell said, quote, "Jake Gibbs wanted to get this kid, and that little monkey gets loose, doesn't he?" The reaction was instantaneous. Across the eastern seaboard, switchboards at ABC affiliates began to light up like Christmas trees. The Washington Post logged dozens of irate calls in real time. In the immediate aftermath, an incredible phenomenon of public misremembering took hold, a sports media Mandela effect. Even today, if you ask people what Howard Cosell said that night, almost everyone will swear up and down that he yelled, "Look at that little monkey run." He didn't. He never said that. But the actual truth of the phrasing didn't matter. The narrative had already escaped the laboratory, and it was accelerating at terminal velocity. By the next morning, a full-blown media firestorm was raging. Reverend Joseph Lowery, the president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, sent a fiery telegram to ABC executives denouncing the comment as a blatant racial slur and demanding a public, unreserved apology. The print media, comprised of hundreds of sports writers who had loathed Cosell's arrogance and massive salary for over a decade, finally smelled blood in the water. They circled the wagons, writing blistering columns painting Cosell as an out-of-touch, closeted bigot. But here is where the story defies every single expectation of a modern outrage cycle. If you look at the raw data and the video archives, Cosell's defense was virtually airtight. First of all, the purported victim of the slur, Alvin Garrett himself, was utterly baffled by the outrage. Garrett publicly stated that he was not offended in the slightest, noting that Cosell had always been deeply complimentary of him and his abilities. Heavyweight champion Muhammad Ali and civil rights leader Jesse Jackson immediately released statements defending Cosell, pointing to his long, documented history of fighting for black athletes. But the most compelling piece of evidence was deeply buried in the network's own archives. Howard Cosell used the phrase "little monkey" as a colloquial term of endearment for anyone who was small and agile. And he used it for white players. 11 years earlier, in a 1972 preseason game between the New York Giants and the Kansas City Chiefs, Cosell referred to Mike Adamel, a 5'8", Caucasian running back, as a little monkey. In 1982, he praised the fielding skills of Glenn Hubbard, a white second baseman for the Atlanta Braves, by saying, "That little monkey can really pick it." Cosell even used the term to describe his own infant grandchildren. To Howard Cosell, it was a harmless, geographically specific idiom related entirely to physical stature and elusiveness, carrying absolutely zero racial malice. But context is always the first casualty in a culture war. The ABC executives were terrified. They were fielding complaints from sponsors, politicians, and civil rights groups. They dragged Cosell into a meeting and presented him with a very simple, incredibly standard corporate off-ramp. All he had to do was look into the camera before the next broadcast, show a little contrition, issue a heavily sanitized corporate apology, and the entire controversy would miraculously vanish into the ether. This brings us to the fatal mistake. The actual anchor that pulled Howard Cosell down into the abyss. He refused. He absolutely, unequivocally refused to apologize. Why? Because in the sharp, legalistic mind of Howard Cosell, an apology was an admission of guilt. To apologize would be to legitimize the accusation that he was a racist. He believed that bending the knee to a mob that was willfully ignoring his 30-year track record of civil rights advocacy was a betrayal of his own soul. He looked at the sports writers demanding his head, the same sports writers who had stood by silently while Muhammad Ali was stripped of his prime fighting years, and he essentially told them to drop dead. His legendary arrogance, the very trait that made him a television god, had suddenly transformed into an impenetrable prison. Now, prepare for a massive pivot, because everything you have been told about the aftermath of this incident is historically inaccurate. The prevailing myth is that ABC fired Howard Cosell that very night, pulling the plug on his microphone and escorting him out of the stadium. That is completely false. Howard Cosell finished that broadcast. He returned the next week. He finished the month of September. In fact, Howard Cosell remained in the Monday Night Football booth for the entire rest of the 1983 NFL season. The network did not fire him. The cancel culture mob of the early 80s failed to actually remove him from his chair. But the damage to his psyche was fatal. The incident fractured something deep and foundational inside of him. As the season dragged on, the relentless drumbeat of criticism in the newspapers continued. Cosell grew increasingly bitter, utterly disgusted by the hypocrisy of the media machine he had helped construct. This psychological breakdown mirrored another massive exit in his career just a few months prior. In late 1982, Cosell had called a heavyweight championship boxing match between Larry Holmes and Randall "Tex" Cobb. It was a grotesque, one-sided massacre. Cobb absorbed a terrifying amount of punishment, and the referee refused to stop the fight. Cosell was so physically sickened by the brutality and the sleaziness of the boxing promoters that he announced, "Live on the air," that he would never broadcast another professional boxing match. He demanded the sport be abolished. By the end of 1983, he was feeling that exact same soul-crushing disillusionment with football. He looked around the league and saw owners moving historic franchises from city to city out of pure greed, which he called a travesty against fan loyalty. He hated the new wave of television broadcasting that was replacing trained, hard-nosed journalists with former coaches and ex-jocks who offered nothing but bland cliches. He famously declared that professional football had devolved into a, quote, stagnant bore. So, at the conclusion of the 1983 season, Howard Cosell didn't get fired. He walked away. He voluntarily relinquished the most powerful throne in sports media. But the true nail in the coffin, the event that finally prompted ABC to completely sever ties with their biggest star, happened 2 years later. In 1985, Cosell published a Scorched-Earth memoir titled, I Never Played the Game. In it, he didn't just burn bridges, he vaporized them. He unleashed furious, unvarnished critiques of his former colleagues, calling out the sycophancy of his broadcast partners, and exposing the ruthless, money-driven underbelly of network television. He held nothing back. ABC executives were so horrified by his absolute refusal to play corporate politics that they swiftly canceled his remaining television show, SportsBeat, effectively banishing the greatest sports broadcaster in American history from the television screen forever. He retreated to radio, suffering a series of health issues after the tragic death of his beloved wife, before passing away in 1995. The tragic irony of Howard Cosell's fatal mistake is that it serves as the exact blueprint for modern digital cancellation, decades before the invention of the internet. The out-of-context audio clip, the complete erasure of historical nuance, the bad faith demands for an apology from people who already hated him, and the final realization that the media machine is perfectly designed to devour its own creators. Cosell thought the truth would save him, but he underestimated the lethal power of a misunderstood narrative. But Howard Cosell's exit is only one piece of the puzzle. If you want to understand exactly how the dark psychology of television contracts is used to trap broadcasters in a gilded cage when they fly too close to the sun, you have to look at the hidden financial clauses that control the industry today. Click the video on your screen right now, and I'll break down exactly how networks secretly destroy careers without ever firing a single person.